Hichilema Hakainde S 2,810,757 2,810,757. I therefore declare the said Hichilema Hakainde S to be President-elect of the Republic of Zambia this 16th day of August 2021.
When Hakainde Hichilema became president of Zambia in 2021, it wasn't just another election. For many Zambians, it felt like the end of a 15-year political marathon. He had contested the presidency 6 times. He had been arrested, charged with treason in 2017 after his convoy allegedly refused to give way to then-President Edgar Lungu's motorcade, and spent more than 100 days in prison without trial. Critics called him Zambia's perennial candidate. Supporters called him the man who simply refused to quit. But 5 years later, the question is sharper. Has the CEO president delivered? Today, we're doing a deep dive into HH, the businessman who became president. What he inherited, why he made the choices he did, what the data actually shows, where the gap between macro numbers and household reality remains painfully wide, and what he's promising for 2026. This is not a campaign video. This is not an opposition hit piece. It is the Africa for Dummies explainer.
To understand why people still call him the CEO president, you have to start with where he came from and why that background matters. Born in 1962 in Monze district to a farming family, HH studied economics and business, worked at Coopers and Libra, now PwC, then built one of Zambia's largest private business groups through investment, consulting, and agribusiness. By the early 2000s, he was one of the country's wealthiest businessmen. Unlike many African leaders who rose through the army, liberation movements, or trade unions, HH came from the private sector. Supporters saw someone who understood balance sheets, investments, and incentives. Critics saw someone who never queued for Millie Meal and was therefore disconnected from ordinary life. Both perceptions still shape every debate about his presidency. The why is simple. When your country is in sovereign default and inflation is running at over 20%, the political class looks for someone who has actually run large organizations that generate revenue rather than consume it. That is the bet Zambia made in 2021.
HH's path was pure endurance. The United Party for National Development, UPND, was founded by Anderson Mazoka, a former mining executive who started politics in the 1990s when the Movement for Multi-Party Democracy, MMD, just came into power. He then ditched the MMD and founded the UPND in 1998. Now, Mazoka came with a bang. He lost to Levi Mwanawasa in 2001 in a razor-thin election. Mwanawasa then became Zambia's 3rd president. Fast forward 5 years later, Mazoka died months before the 2006 election. After a brief party tussle, Hichilema inherited leadership of the UPND. Now, Hichilema lost in 2006, 2008, and 2011, coming 3rd place. And in 2015 and 2016, he started coming 2nd place. Why keep running? In a country where power had rotated between a small set of political networks, persistence itself became a brand. By 2021, the combination of economic pain under the Patriotic Front, youth frustration, and HH's reputation for personal discipline produced a decisive 59% victory. The why it finally worked is instructive. Voters were not just tired of one man, they were tired of a model of governance that had produced Africa's first pandemic-era default.
But wait, context is everything. In 2021, Zambia had just become the first African country to default on its external debt during the COVID era. External obligations stood at roughly $13 billion. Inflation had hit the mid-20s, the kwacha had lost significant value, investor confidence was near zero, power shortages were routine, government borrowing looked unsustainable to most independent economists. None of this is an excuse for later performance. It is the baseline. Why does the baseline matter? because the previous growth model, which was heavy external borrowing, especially from China and commercial markets, combined with large subsidies and weak revenue collection, had hit a wall. HH's team calculated that without restoring debt sustainability and macroeconomic credibility, no amount of spending would be financeable. The calculation drove the entire first term.
Here's where even the many independent economists give credit. Zambia negotiated a restructuring of the bulk of its external debt under the G20 Common Framework. One of the first and most complete examples of the process, an IMF Extended Credit Facility program was secured and largely completed. Inflation fell from peaks of above 20 to 24% into single digits, recently reading around 6.5%. Foreign reserves recovered to multi-year highs. Tax collections hit record levels, helped by better administrative and higher mineral royalties. Credit ratings agencies began upgrading Zambia out of that default territory. Now, why did this matter? Because default locks a country out of affordable capital. Restructuring and an IMF program reopened the door. The government argues the first 5 years were about repairing the foundation, so the next 5 years could be about building on it. For international investors, the signals were positive. For ordinary households, the story was far more complicated.
And this is HH's biggest political vulnerability. Macroeconomic stabilization does not automatically lower the price of meal, transport, or electricity. Many Zambians still face high food prices, intermittent power, unemployment, and eroded purchasing power. The severe 2023 to 2025 El Nino drought made everything worse. Hydroelectric power generation collapsed, agriculture suffered, and food inflation spiked. Economists call this the macro-micro gap. The national accounts improved while household budgets don't. Why does the gap persist? Partly because reforms that restore fiscal space, removing some subsidies, tightening expenditure, prioritizing debt service are front-loaded and are very painful. Partly because Zambia remains heavily exposed to climate shocks and global copper prices. And partly because higher tax revenue and mining activity in broad-based income growth takes longer than one electoral cycle. The political question for 2026 is brutally simple. Am I better off than 5 years ago?
The government has not stood still. The flagship domestic program is the Constituency Development Fund, CDF. Allocations per constituency jumped from about 1.6 million kwacha in 2021 to 25.7 million kwacha in 2022. Now that's more than 1,500%, and continued rising in 2025 to 36.1 million kwacha. And in 2026, it stands at 14 million kwacha. National totals moved from a few hundreds of millions of kwacha to over 6 billion kwacha. The money finances the classrooms, health posts, boreholes, local roads, youth and women's grants, as well as skill scholarships. Supporters call it decentralization, whilst critics point to variable absorption capacity in local councils and uneven quality of projects. Why prioritize CDF and free education? Because the political theory is that visible local delivery and human capital investment can eventually convert macroeconomic gains into political support, even if the transmission mechanism is somewhat slow or uneven.
One of President Hichilema's flagship reforms has been the introduction of free education in late 2021, which abolished school fees from early childhood through secondary school. According to Zambia's Ministry of Education and UNICEF, the policy has brought over 2 million additional learners into the education system. To keep the pace, the government recruited more than 40,000 teachers between 2022 and 2025, improving the national student-to-teacher ratio from roughly 56 to 67 students to 1 teacher to around 46 students to 1 teacher by 2025. But access is only part of the story. While national averages have improved, UNICEF education audits and the ministry's own education statistics bulletin show that the many rural and high-density urban schools still faced overcrowded classrooms, with some recording 70 to over 100 pupils per teacher, alongside shortages of classrooms, desks, and learning materials. So while the policy is widely praised for dramatically expanding access and equity, critics argue that the quality of education and supporting infrastructure have struggled to keep pace. Now, whilst the UPND was making gains in the CDF and free education spaces, one problem still persists: mining still dominates. Copper accounts for roughly 70 to 75% of export earnings. The government has made expansion the centerpiece of its growth strategy. Reopen closed mines, attract new capital, resolve old disputes, and target 3 million tons of annual copper production by the early 2030s, from under 900,000 tons recently. Progress is visible. Production has been climbing and major investments have been announced. But the deeper question still remains. Is Zambia merely extracting more raw copper, or is it capturing more value? Development economists such as Ken Opalo warn of the classic enclave problem. Imagine a spaceship that lands on Earth, extracts the resources, and flies back into space, leaving nothing on the planet. This is similar to how the mining sector in Zambia operates. I mean, sure, these mines provide taxes which we use to fund the state, as well as social programs like funding some of our beloved soccer teams. Ultimately, Zambians aren't really gaining value from their resources. Whilst the UPND and many other politicians are pushing for more copper production and perhaps opening of new mines, the questions some economists have raised is if this will bring desired outcomes. What I mean by that is opening new mines is extremely expensive, and to get to start generating profits will take a long time. Wouldn't it be easier to find ways in which Zambians can be integrated into the mining value chain? For instance, see, one of the mines uses a particular chemical, which it has to order from South Africa or China. Why not support local Zambian businesses to produce and supply said chemical? Also, there is a very high probability that the device you're watching this video on has copper or cobalt from Zambia. Why not make motherboards or chips in Zambia? Nevertheless, the aggressive volume target by HH is because copper is central to the global energy transition. Zambia wants to ride that wave while it lasts. The risk is that volume without linkages simply reproduces the old pattern at a larger scale.
Agriculture tells a parallel story. The Farmer Input Support Program was cleaned up after audits revealed roughly 280,000 ghost beneficiaries. Removing them frees resources for genuine smallholders. Implementation has been uneven, and some legitimate farmers report difficulties during the transition. Why does this matter exactly? Because elite capture of subsidy programs is one of the most common ways public money actually disappears in the region. Cleaning the register is necessary but politically costly. Exactly the kind of reform that improves long-term efficiency while creating short-term grievances.
No presidency escapes criticism. Civil society organizations have raised concerns over the use of public order laws, media freedoms, and the treatment of some opposition figures. Others argue anti-corruption efforts appear inconsistent depending on who is under investigation. The government rejects many of these accusations, arguing that law enforcement institutions operate independently and that high-profile cases are evidence of accountability rather than political persecution. On the specific question of corruption, the data shows a modest but measurable shift. According to the Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index (CPI), the most widely cited global measure of the perceived corruption, Zambia's score stood at 33 out of 100 in both 2021 and 2022. By the way, on this scale, 0 means super corrupt and 100 means squeaky clean. It then rose to 37 in 2023 and peaked at 39 in 2024, when the country improved its global ranking from the high 110s into the low 90s, 92nd out of 180 to be precise. In the 2025 CPI, the score slipped back 2 points to 37 and the rank fell to 99th overall.
In other words, under HH, Zambia recorded a clear improvement in perceived corruption for the first full 3 years, moving well above its previous decade average before a modest setback in the run-up to the 2026 election. The peak of 39 remains the highest score Zambia has ever recorded in more than a decade, yet it's still below the global average of around 43 and trails several regional peers such as Botswana, Rwanda, Namibia, as well as South Africa. Why the early gains? Analysts basically point to digital reforms in licensing and procurement, stronger beneficial ownership rules, increased funding for the Anti-Corruption Commission, and the simple fact that a new administration has disrupted some previous patronage networks. Why the 2025 dip? Transparency International Zambia itself links it partly to perceptions of abuse of office and the diversion of public resources through politically connected businesses and interests as the election approached. The CPI is a perception index, not a direct count of cases. It moves slowly and can be influenced by high-profile scandals or political timing. Still, the trajectory is useful. A measurable reduction in perceived corruption relative to the immediate pre-2021 baseline, followed by a warning that progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. A softer but persistent criticism concerns communication. Some analysts believe the government has struggled to explain why macroeconomic reforms take years before ordinary citizens begin feeling tangible benefits. Politics is not just about results. It's also about convincing the people that results are actually coming.
What is HH promising next? From HH will fix it in 2021 to one of the most robotic sounding political slogans I have ever heard. 10-10-5-3-3-1-1. You heard it right. For 2026, the centerpiece is the 10-10-5-3-3-1-1 production roadmap. 10 million tons of maize, 10 gigawatts of electricity, 5 million tourist arrivals, 3 million tons of copper, 3 million tons of soybean, 1 million tons of wheat, $1 billion in beef exports. The argument is sequential. The first term repaired the fiscal and debt foundation. The second term must convert stability into volume, jobs, and household income. Supporters see ambition grounded in reforms already made. Critics see targets that still depend on climate, infrastructure delivery, and implementation capacity that have historically been Zambia's weak point.
When people judge presidents, they usually look at what happens at home. Jobs, electricity, the price of meal. But behind every one of those issues is another question. How does the rest of the world see your country? Because if investors don't trust your economy, banks won't lend, companies won't invest, and governments won't partner with you. In many ways, President Hakainde Hichilema's first foreign policy challenge wasn't convincing Zambians. It was actually convincing the world that Zambians are open for business and Zambia is actually back on the international scene. And that's an important distinction. Historically, Zambia has never been a military heavyweight or an economic superpower. Its influence has come from something less tangible: credibility. During Kenneth Kaunda's presidency, Lusaka became the diplomatic capital of Southern Africa's liberation struggle. Freedom fighters came from South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, Angola, Mozambique, and all found political support in Zambia. There's a thing called the 1969 Lusaka Manifesto, which cemented Zambia's reputation as a principled, non-aligned voice against colonialism and racial oppression. The history still carries enormous diplomatic weight today. But the world has actually changed. Liberation diplomacy has largely been replaced by economic diplomacy, using foreign policy to attract investment, expand trade, create jobs, and unlock development. And that has become the defining feature of President Hichilema's international strategy.
Everything begins with debt. When Hichilema entered office in August 2021, Zambia wasn't just facing economic hardship. It had become the first African country to default on its sovereign debt during the COVID-19 pandemic, after failing to repay international creditors in 2020. Roughly $13 billion in external debt needed restructuring. That wasn't simply Zambia's problem. The entire international financial community was watching. Could the new G20 common framework actually work? Or would the debt restructuring become trapped in endless negotiations? After years of talks involving China, Western governments, commercial bondholders, and international financial institutions, Zambia eventually became one of the first countries to successfully restructure its debt under the framework. Today, economists frequently point to Zambia as one of the world's most closely studied debt restructuring case studies. For President Hichilema, this became far more than an economic success. It became the diplomatic capital. That credibility opened doors. At international gatherings like the Paris Summit for the new Global Financing Pact, President Hichilema wasn't simply another African leader attending a conference. He spoke as the president of a country that had actively lived through sovereign default. That gave Zambia unusual authority in global debates about debt justice, climate finance, and reforming the international financial system. Back on the continent, Zambia also became increasingly active in discussions on reforming African institutions. President Hichilema has participated in the African Union's Committee of 10 on institutional reform, while consistently supporting broader calls to modernize global financial institutions such as the IMF and World Bank. In many ways, Zambia's voice has aligned with wider African reform efforts championed by leaders like Kenya's William Ruto, who has become one of Africa's leading advocates for global financial reform, and South Africa's Cyril Ramaphosa, who has used South Africa's G20 presidency to push similar reforms.
One criticism sometimes leveled at HH is that he is too pro-West. But when you look closely at the evidence, the picture is much more nuanced. Rather than choosing sides, Zambia has largely pursued what foreign policy scholars call multi-alignment, which is basically working with multiple partners simultaneously to maximize national interest. On one hand, the United States and European Union partners have become increasingly involved in Zambia's critical mineral sector. The flagship project is the Lobito Corridor, a major rail and logistics network connecting Zambia's copper belt through the DRC to Angola's Atlantic coast. If successful, it could reduce transport costs, diversify export routes, and strengthen supply chains for copper and cobalt, minerals central to the global green energy transition. On the other hand, China remains one of Zambia's most important economic partners. Chinese investment continues across multiple sectors, while discussions have intensified around revitalizing and rehabilitating the historic Tanzania-Zambia railway line, Tazara Railway. The iconic line built in the 1970s that still symbolizes one of Africa's most enduring development partnerships with China. Rather than replacing Beijing with Washington or Washington with Beijing, HH's government has largely tried to keep both relationships alive. The balancing act is also reflected in President Hichilema's travel diplomacy. Since taking office in 2021, Hichilema has undertaken more than 50 international trips ranging from week-long state visits in China to shorter diplomatic engagements around the continent. South Africa has been his most frequently visited destination, clearly reflecting not only the country's role as Zambia's largest trade partner, but also the importance of the Southern African bloc, SADC, and investment in regional coordination. Critics have questioned the cost of the frequency of some of these trips. The government, however, argues that they are much smaller delegations than before and are designed to actually attract foreign direct investment, unlock trade opportunities, and build Zambia's international credibility following the debt default. For a country with just over 21 million people, Zambia has quietly been punching above its weight in international diplomacy. At the African Union, Zambia currently serves as the continental champion on ending child marriage, helping coordinate efforts to reduce one of Africa's most persistent social challenges. At the United Nations, Zambia has gone even further. The country was selected to co-facilitate negotiations on the UN Global Digital Compact, which is basically a landmark agreement under the Pact for the Future, widely viewed as one of the building blocks for global digital governance beyond the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, which will expire in 2030. In simple terms, while countries debate artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and digital rights, Zambia has had a seat at the negotiating table, helping shape the rules. For a lower middle-income country in Africa, that's no small achievement. We've also seen mixed fortunes in placing Zambians in high places internationally. On the success side, Engineer Keziah Kazuba Mwale was selected as Secretary General of the African Telecommunications Union, an organization that helps shape everything from broadband standards and spectrum allocation to satellite cooperation across Africa. On the other hand, Zambia narrowly missed securing one of the continent's most influential financial positions. Former World Bank Vice President Dr. Samuel Munzele Maimbo finished a strong second in the race to become the President of the Africa Development Bank. Although unsuccessful, his candidacy demonstrates the growing international profile of Zambian professionals. On the peace and security front, another subtle shift under HH has been the growing visibility of peace and security diplomacy. Zambia continues to deploy more than 900 troops in the United Nations peacekeeping mission in the Central African Republic. The mission is known as MINUSCA, maintaining its long-standing reputation as one of Africa's reliable troop-contributing countries. The government has also supported initiatives such as the Africa Peace Initiative in Ukraine, recognizing that conflicts thousands of kilometers away can still affect Zambia through rising fertilizer prices, disrupted grain exports, and higher food inflation. Now, perhaps the biggest misconception about Zambia's foreign policy is that it swings dramatically depending on who occupies State House. The reality is far more complicated. President Hichilema is often described as more pro-Western than his predecessor, Edgar Lungu. Certainly, this government has strengthened engagement with Western partners on debt restructuring and critical minerals, but when you look more closely, Zambia's diplomacy under both administrations has been far more pragmatic than ideological. Take President Lungu's tenure. In 2018, relations with the United Kingdom deteriorated after London suspended funding to Zambia's social cash transfer program over corruption allegations. Lusaka rejected the move as interference in its domestic affairs, and President Lungu notably snubbed the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in London, a very rare diplomatic rebuke that signaled Zambia was prepared to push back against traditional Western partners when it believed sovereignty was at stake. President Hichilema's administration also had its own moments of tension. In 2025 and 2026, the United States ambassador to Zambia publicly criticized the government over corruption involving theft of donated medicines, triggering unusually direct diplomatic exchanges between Lusaka and Washington. Around the same period, Zambia also hesitated to sign a proposed US-backed health and data partnership linked to critical minerals, citing concerns over data governance, sovereignty, and the strategic value of Zambia's mineral resources. In other words, while HH may enjoy warmer relations with Western capitals than his predecessor, that hasn't prevented his government from saying no when it believes Zambian national interests are better served by doing so. The same pragmatism can be seen elsewhere. Relations with Israel, for example, strengthened following President Isaac Herzog's 2025 state visit and the opening of the Israeli embassy in Lusaka, basically reciprocating Zambia's opening in Tel Aviv under President Lungu. Yet, despite warming bilateral ties, Zambia has continued to support the majority of United Nations General Assembly resolutions backing Palestinian rights, demonstrating that strengthening one bilateral relationship has not fundamentally altered its long-standing multilateral voting pattern. A similar balancing act plays out closer to home. Despite occasionally positioning itself as a champion of democracy and constitutionalism, Zambia has generally opted a cautious approach towards political crisis in the region. Following Zimbabwe's heavily contested 2023 election, relations experienced moments of tension, but both governments ultimately prioritized continued diplomatic engagement over public confrontation. Likewise, Zambia's responses to concerns over governance and democratic backsliding in countries like Tanzania and Madagascar have often been measured rather than outspoken. Critics argue that this selective approach creates the impression of inconsistency, that Zambia speaks strongly on some democratic issues while remaining relatively quiet on others. Supporters counter that regional diplomacy, particularly with the Southern African bloc SADC, often depends less on public criticism and more on quiet diplomacy, consensus building, as well as maintaining working relationships with neighboring governments. Ultimately, what emerges is a foreign policy that is less about choosing between East or West, or between ideology and principle, and more about navigating complicated world through pragmatism, national interest, and strategic flexibility. Whether engaging Washington, Beijing, Brussels, Tel Aviv, or Harare, successive Zambian governments have shown a willingness to cooperate where interests align and to push back where they don't.
Now here's the question that really matters. Why should any of this concern someone buying a bag of mealie meal in Chilenje or farming maize in Monze? Because foreign policy only matters if it changes life at home. If diplomacy lowers borrowing costs, the government has more room to invest. If foreign investors build processing plants, more jobs are created. If the Lobito corridor reduces transport costs, copper becomes more competitive. If tensions in the Middle East disrupts oil supplies, fuel prices in Lusaka rise. Foreign policy isn't some distant conversation between presidents in expensive suits. It's about whether fertilizer becomes cheaper, whether mines expand, whether businesses hire, whether electricity projects get financed, whether young people find work. Countries like Singapore, Vietnam, and South Korea transformed diplomacy into an engine of economic development by aligning their foreign trade and investment policies. That is ultimately the benchmark HH's administration will be judged against. He has restored much of Zambia's international credibility after default. He has rebuilt confidence among investors. He has kept channels open with both East and West. And he has expanded Zambia's diplomatic visibility on issues from debt reform to digital governance. But in the end, foreign policy isn't judged by applause at international summits. It's judged by something much simpler. Whether ordinary Zambians feel the benefits when they get home from work, fill up their cars, or sit down at the dinner table. If this deep dive helped you understand the why behind the numbers, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments how you assess HH's first term. We'll see you in the next Africa for Dummies Explainer.